You're listening to KRUU LP, 100.1 FM, the voice of Fairfield, Iowa. Welcome to Open Views, an exploration of free culture and collaborative development projects around the world. I'm your host, Sundar Raman. Cory Doctorow's name has come up a few times on previous episodes of this show. Cory's book Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, published in January 2003, was the first novel ever released under one of the Creative Commons licenses, which I've spoken about many times on this show. Cory Doctorow is an award-winning science fiction author. He won the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer in 2000, the Locus Award for Best First Novel for Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom in 2003. And in 2004, he won the Sunburst Award for Best Canadian Science Fiction Book for his short story collection, A Place So Foreign, and 8 more. The collection also contained his short story, Ownerized, which was nominated for the 2003 Nebula Award and was profiled on Salon.com in 2002. Cory's novels mirror some of his physical world activism. The themes in his novels include digital rights management, or DRM, peer-to-peer models, perhaps derived from his stint as a dot-com entrepreneur when he founded open-source peer-to-peer company OpenCola, and post-scarcity economics, which deals with the question of what happens to economic models when traditional scarcities such as human resources become not so scarce. In last week's show, Michelle Bowens brought up this point as well, and it's an important consideration in peer-based models for society. His activism was put to good use when he worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation for 4 years, as European Affairs Coordinator, helping to set up the Open Rights Group, and Cory continues now as a fellow at the EFF. In 2006, Cory Doctorow was selected as the Canada-US Fulbright recipient and took on the role of visiting professor to the University of Southern California's Center for Public Diplomacy. Each year, USC's Center for Public Diplomacy hosts a different notable Canadian to this position. The partnership is designed to attract Canada's most prominent scholars to USC's Center on Public Diplomacy, a global leader in studying how countries communicate about themselves to students of other countries. I have re-aired a couple of the lectures from Cory's speaker series at USC, one with guests John Gilmore and John Perry Barlow, and the other with EFF lawyer Fred von Lohman. Perhaps Cory's most visible persona is in his regular posts to boingboing.net. As of this afternoon, boingboing.net is the third most popular blog in the world, according to technorati.com. Boingboing's tagline is, "A directory of wonderful things," and it really is. It's perhaps the only site that I check virtually every day to learn about everything from antique wallpaper to string theory. And of course, Cory's regular updates on the state of copyright and intellectual property. Cory Doctorow is my guest today on Open Views, and he spoke to me about everything from his introduction to the free culture world and his take on the future of the open philosophy. Joining me on Open Views on KRUU LP 100.1 FM.
My pleasure.
I want to start off by asking about your background as a writer. Why do you release your stuff under Creative Commons? Why are you a copy fighter?
Well, there's how I got there and why I do it now, and they are different questions. But I had the good fortune to work in bookstores and to do a little volunteer work at pub while I was coming up, while I was waiting to sell some of my first stories. And what that did was give me a lot of perspective on what happens to books when they're published. I think a lot of writers and indeed readers have this idea that, that a book is this very special and venerated object that has this enduring presence in the world. And, I had more of a realpolitik view of it. I understood that books kind of vanish. You'd see great books turn up, and you would love them, and you talk them up to your customers, and then the hardcover would be in as a remainder in 6 months, and then the paperback would come out 6 months after that, and then the paperback would be out of print. You couldn't get more copies of it in after a year, and then you'd start seeing it come into the used section, and then you'd be pricing it down to the dollar bin out front, right. And that was it. It just vanished. And I came to realize that my problem really wasn't that people were going to rip me off, that I'd be a lucky man if people ripped me off, that In fact, my big problem was that no one was going to care enough about me to rip me off, and that would be an infinitely worse world to inhabit. And so I, at the same time, have always been involved with computers and the Internet. We had a teletype terminal. My dad is not E.L. Doctorow, but is in fact Gord Doctorow, a computer scientist, had computers around the house from about 1977 on. And those computers, that earliest computer we had was actually a teletype terminal connected to a mainframe at the University of Toronto. And I had seen the way that networks were moving, and it seemed to me like this would be a great way for me to reach other people and for me to put my book in front of people who might not otherwise see it, and that most importantly that it would be a way for people who loved the book and who found it to share their love of it with other people, that electronic texts were inherently social. You know, we worry a lot about copying, but the copying we worry about isn't by and large copying that takes place in your home, right? In other words, when you, I don't know, photocopy a comic strip out of your Bloom County treasury and stick it on the door of your office, that's not the copying that the law really concerns itself with, although, you know, technically it's as much of an infringement as any. But the copying we really concern ourselves with is the copying where one person makes a copy for another. But there's another way to think about that. That's kind of an endorsement. When one person makes a copy for another, that's a social act. It can't take place without at least two parties being involved. Right. And social recommendations, I have seen working in the bookstore particularly, are almost infinitely powerful for writers and for other creative people. That when someone walks into the store with a friend and that friend starts to pull books off the shelf and saying, you must read this, you must read this, you must read this, it changed my life, you'll love it, you know that you're going to ring up a huge sale before the day is out, that those people are going to walk out of the store with a lot of books under their arms. Right. And that's an amazing thing. And I just thought, you know, rather than fight this, why don't I harness this?
It could be argued that that's great when you're an up-and-coming publisher or artist, but you are at the point where you're actually getting a lot of recognition. You're an award-winning science fiction author. So why continue with that model when you've already established your fan base, and you could continue quite well even under a traditional, you know, publishing contract, and you would probably make a lot more money that way, wouldn't you?
Well, I don't think I'd make more money. I still think that I sell far more copies than are displaced by electronic text, and part of that is the miracle of electronic text, which is that it's almost impossible to read long, drawn-out, thought-requiring electronic text off of the screen because computers are just so distracting. That anytime you sit in front of a computer for long enough to read a whole novel off of it, you find yourself answering your IMs and your emails and Googling things and making Wikipedia contributions and whatever, you know, playing a little WoW and maybe a hand of solitaire. And by the time it's done, if you like the book, chances are you're just going to get the print edition because by dint of being so stupid, a book can't distract you. It doesn't have any smart features. So I think that I sell more copies than I lose, you know, and ultimately that's the big question that we all have about the network is does it displace more activity than it generates? And, you know, I think that for books it's always the case that it creates more leads than it substitutes for the print book with people who would otherwise be your customer.
Right.
So I'm pretty sanguine about that, actually. You flatter me that my career is doing so well that I don't need whatever attention could be created by having fans. Science fiction writers just don't make a lot of money by and large. And if they do, they tend to make it from alternative sources, not directly from the books, but from the things that the books can lead to, consulting contracts, speaking contracts, commissions to write articles and reports and so on. And that's certainly where I make most of my money. I certainly don't make most of my money from royalties on my books. I mean, there's just not a lot of money there in it for almost everyone who writes books. There's not a lot of money in royalties. There's a lot more money in licensing and in other deals than there is there. And the more widely known my books are, the more of that revenue comes in. And so for me, having a more widely known book just leads to more money. You know,
so
and for my publisher, it just leads to more sales. So it's good all the way around.
Well, in a sense, the common misconception about Creative Commons and open licensing or free software is that you cannot make money out of the model because it's all about like giving your stuff away, and you know, part of the philosophy is that you shouldn't make money, almost like a communist strategy or something. But obviously, you're saying that that's not true.
Well, no. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the point of open licensing is giving away stuff that where it doesn't cost you anything, or where it makes you more money than it costs you.
your success can arguably be tied to the amount of work that you put into distributing your work, and the fact that you're incredibly hardworking, considering you have a position at the EFF, you're a daily contributor.
Oh, not anymore.
Not anymore.
No, since last January, I've been January 1st, 2006. I've been a fellow of EFF, but
okay.
I don't have a staff position there anymore.
Okay.
I'm a full-time writer.
You're a full-time. Well, you're also teaching at University of Southern California.
That's right. Yeah.
And you're a regular poster to Boing Boing. It's a very full day by any stretch of by any meter. So, does the Creative Commons model, the open licensing model, require that more responsibility be taken by the artist, by the creator, in order to make that work more distributed and more public?
I think ultimately Creative Commons' great strength is in enabling people who already love your stuff to promote it better. What it doesn't do is it doesn't make people love your stuff. And there's two things that have to be combined in order to get people to love your stuff. One is you have to write something good, and the other is that you have to make sure that people know about it. And Creative Commons doesn't help you do either of those things.
Okay.
What it can do is take something that you've written that's good, that people have found out about through some mechanism, and make it easier for them to promote it to their friends.
You're a pretty vocal critic of DRM, and you have several posts on Boing Boing about the evils of DRM, or at least anti-DRM posts. Could you explain for my audience what DRM is and why you feel it's not a good thing for society in general?
So DRM is that technology that's used to stop you from copying or making use of things that you own, like DVDs and internet movies and some CDs and digital audio, music you buy from the iTunes Music Store, and so on. And DRM has a number of failings, but for me, the one that's most important is that DRM is technology that is used to make your computer take orders from someone other than you. In other words, you get a PDF that's got DRM on it, you select some text, and you select copy, and the PDF says, no, you're not allowed to, because some remote party, someone else, not you, not the person who owns this computer, has instructed me to take orders from them and not from you. Mm. And I think that the difference, speaking as a science fiction writer here, the difference between a utopia and a dystopia is whether we control the machines or the machines control us.
Right.
And the great strength of the PC and the Internet revolution has been enabling people to use machines that do their bidding to improve their lives. And DRM can never do that. I think it's a fundamentally immoral proposition to distribute technology that takes orders from people other than its owner. Sometimes people accuse me of being anti-property because I believe in copyright reform. But what could be more pro-property than saying that your computer should listen to you and not some coked-up Hollywood fat cat thousands of miles away in Hollywood who's decided what you can and can't do with a movie?
Well, the concept of copyright right now is about who owns this nebulous this right. It's hard to really classify it as property because it's not physical property like in the traditional sense that we're used to thinking about it. The copyright is held by someone, but it's the right for you to even listen to it outside of a particular medium or derive from it outside of a particular permission clause, I guess. So in this case, this is the model that these guys have created with the music industry. So how does DRM not fit into that?
Well, so that's a very formalistic view of copyright. Although it's true that technically any right can be licensed, any right that you can imagine can be licensed. There are certain rights that have never been the subject of licensing because they were technically impossible to enforce, like a license to listen to music only on Wednesdays, or a license to listen to music only if you're white, or a license to listen to music only if you're female, or a license to listen to music only if you're in a high-income nation according to the World Bank.
Right.
None of those things were ever set out as contractual clauses because they couldn't be. Right now I'm having an argument with the British Broadcasting Corporation that's saying that they're having a hard time acquiring the rights from rights holders to allow British Broadcasting Corporation viewers, the license payers who support it directly through their license fees in the UK, to watch these shows without DRM. And they're saying, well, we don't have the right to redistribute it over the Internet. They also don't have the right to let you video record it and watch it at home at a later date.
Right.
But they don't need that right because you can do that whether or not they have the right. Or no one sues, and technically you could imagine that a rights holder could go to the BBC and they could say, well, we're only licensing you the non-VCR recordable right to air this movie. And if you want the VCR recordable right, you're going to have to pay more. And we won't license to you at all unless you agree to take such measures as will allow us to stop people from recording this movie. And that's fundamentally what's happening with their digital distribution strategy. And it's pretty broken. And I think ultimately unfair to take what is, after all, a government-granted monopoly that's intended to provide the minimal incentive necessary to produce the largest amount of work and bootstrap that into a right to control how devices are designed, how they're used, what you can do in the privacy of your own home, your own private use and reuse of material is bizarre and completely out of step with the historical contours of copyright law, which have traditionally bound the relationships between large commercial entities and haven't bound individuals who are doing merely consumptive or personally transformative uses. So historically, if you wanted to watch a TV show, you didn't have to make a copy of it.
Right.
And so copyright law didn't enter into it. Right? Whether or not what you did while you were watching television was just not a subject of copyright law. But as soon as television moves onto the Internet, all viewing is also copying.
Right.
You can't watch a show of the Internet without copying the show. And so suddenly this body of law that's intended to govern the relationships between large commercial entities binds on you. It's as though in order to loan a friend $5 for lunch, you have to go to law school for 5 years and study securities regulations to make sure that you're doing all the proper SEC filings.
I mean, the argument that the studios make always, and this is, you actually talked about this in a recent post, is that this is how they make money. If they don't have DRM, if they don't restrict what people can do with the content, they start losing their revenue stream. And I mean, your argument to that is figure out how to make money by not restricting it, because people are going to be sharing it anyway. But
yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's any future in which bits are going to be harder to copy. I think that from here on in, it just gets easier. I mean, is there going to be a future in which hard drives are more expensive and hold fewer bits and are larger, or which networks run slower and are harder to find? I mean, bits are just going to get harder to copy, easier to copy from here on in. So anyone who actually believes that their business can only survive if they can control copying, they're already dead. It's like saying I can only survive if the Earth doesn't have any oxygen in its atmosphere, or if water stops being wet. I mean, tough. That's how it goes. Go join the pool of people who've been put out of work by the Internet, like travel agents and all those other people who used to have good, high-paying jobs before technology made them obsolete. And we'll still have media. It seems pretty clear to me that $300 million Police Academy sequels aren't the only way to make movies. And that people have shown their willingness to create infinite varieties of media in ways that are endemic to the Internet. I mean, one of the things that the Internet does, in addition to lowering the cost of distribution, and in many ways lowering the cost of marketing because of social recommendations and lowering the search costs, but also it lowers the cost of collaboration. And that's I think, at the core of something like the free software movement, is that it's really cheap to cooperate with other people to make stuff in a way that it's never been before.
Yeah.
And that, I think, fundamentally changes these economics. I mean, look, when the Protestant Reformation came around, we lost cathedrals, right? You can't build a multi-generational project like a cathedral that takes, say, 75 years and costs the equivalent of billions. If you, instead of having one true church, have 1,000 wee kirks, 1,000 tiny little churches, each of which preaching their own version of the gospel. And cathedrals are nice. I like cathedrals. They're cool. But to say that the end of the Protestant Reformation, by bringing about the end of the cathedral, ended religion is wrong.
Right.
Actually, the opposite happened. The Protestant Reformation brought more religion to more places and more variety of religion than we'd ever had before. By the same token, $300 million movies can be a perfectly pleasant way to spend a Saturday afternoon. But I tell you, they're a crummy way to end technological progress.
Right.
And if it turns out that we have to give up the $300 million movie in order to get the Internet, I know which one I pick.
There's a lot better stuff on YouTube than what's coming out of Hollywood. But
in aggregate.
The Steve Jobs statement recently about, he'd rather not have DRM, and Yahoo, jumping on that bandwagon as well. Obviously, I've had questions from some of my listeners that, they're now getting rid of copyright. Obviously, that's not true, but what do you think about the fact that this is what, companies like Apple are promoting, but there's also a disingenuity to it because they're saying we should not have DRM on music so that it increases our sales, while at the same time locking down their operating system to a very specific hardware platform and not providing any kind of licensing options at all from that perspective.
Well, I think with Apple, it's actually, there's a much more straight line in which this is very mealy-mouthed and self-serving, which is Steve Jobs at the one hand is saying, well, I'd like to get rid of DRM. It does us no good. Of course, it does Apple a ton of good, although it doesn't stop people from making copies. What it surely does do is lock people into buying iPods. If you've bought $100 worth of iTunes music in the last 2 or 3 years, and you decide you want to switch from an iPod to a competing device, you have to be prepared to abandon your investment in that music.
Right.
And that's the only reason Steve Jobs likes DRM, is that it locks people into the Mac. It locks people, or into the iPod rather. It stops people from switching. You remember those Apple Switch campaigns that were, they spent so much money on to tell people how great it was that one vendor could make a product that interoperated with another vendor's product, and that you as the customer could choose whose product you wanted to use at any time. Steve has set out to make sure that no one can do it.
Right.
And he really hated DRM. Instead of just wanting to deflect the blame for this lock-in situation, which has attracted a lot of regulatory attention in Europe, if he really wanted to get rid of DRM, then we wouldn't have DRM on all the Pixar movies that they sell through the iTunes Music Store.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have DRM on all the indie stuff. And people say, if they had DRM on some things and not on others, it would provide an inconsistent user experience, and Apple doesn't want to do that. But Apple already has that. If you download some podcasts, they have DRM on them. The podcasts that come from Audible every week, that they show up still in your podcast window, and they're there all the time. And if you download other podcasts like mine, they have no DRM on them.
Right.
And if Apple really hated DRM, there wouldn't be any DRM on the iPod. Because when you put music, not just music that you buy from the iTunes Music Store that they've licensed from the record companies, when you put music like or audio like my podcast, which is Creative Commons license, which says you're not allowed to use DRM, when you put that on your iPod, Apple adds DRM to it. They take technological countermeasures to keep you from copying that from your iPod back onto your hard drive. Ed Felton has pointed out that if you believe that Steve Jobs only added DRM to his music because the music companies made him, then for him to say, well, I'll take the DRM off of my files if the music companies will let me, is not much of a promise at all. It's kind of like a 6-year-old saying, I won't go to the dentist's office if my parents don't make me.
Right.
In other words, if he didn't have the negotiating power to insist that there not be DRM on his music, then he won't have the negotiating power to insist that there must be DRM money on his music, or DRM technology on his music. So once the music industry tells him no DRM, of course he'll say no DRM. But there are independent artists. There's movies in his movies and television from Disney, ABC, Pixar, which he's the single largest shareholder in, and many other files in the iTunes Music Store and in iTunes that are delivered with DRM that he could take the DRM off of right now. And if he really means that he would take the DRM out of the iTunes Music Store in a heartbeat if the rights holders would let him, well then the heartbeat has happened. It's time for him to do it.
You're listening to Open Views on KRUU-LP 100.1 FM and KRUUFM.com. My guest today is Cory Doctorow, author, copyright reform activist, and blogger at boingboing.net. Cory is an award-winning science fiction author and releases all his books with a Creative Commons license. Cory's website is craphound.com.
The debate on the pro-CC or the pro-free culture debate has largely dwelled on the fact that the commons is being degraded, the cultural commons is being degraded by restrictive copyright or restrictive clauses on reuse of content. The digital piracy world has almost contributed more to the virtual commons that people are actually feeding off of now than any period before. Like the fact that you have thousands of movies, all of the Oscar movies are now online. I'm sure someone in India has already downloaded them and a bunch of people are watching them, and it's going to be contributing towards the next generation of movies that are being made by film students. And that's happening because of piracy, not because the the Creative Commons idea has taken root. So what are your thoughts on that, and where does the world of piracy fit in with Creative Commons when piracy itself has had an incredibly enriching influence on culture in some of these areas?
Well, I think Creative Commons is intended to be a politicizing ideology for people who have found virtue in piracy to move towards. So, in other words, I think a lot of ideology starts with kind of self-interest, right? And I think that it'd be nice if I could get this thing for free. Oh, look, here's that song I was looking for. Isn't that great? And I think that when the first blows were struck against that kind of activity, right, when Napster was taken down, that we didn't really have a political vocabulary or an ideological vocabulary to explain why that was wrong, why it was wrong for them to take away Napster. Even though Napster was the largest library of human creativity ever assembled,
right.
Even though it had been assembled for free, and even running for free, we didn't really have the vocabulary or the perspective to defend its virtues. We had bought into the other side's rhetoric. And I think that what Creative Commons is about starting people thinking about what a world could be like if instead of having these proprietary failures where 80% of the music ever recorded isn't available for sale anywhere in the world, and where giant libraries are burned down by capricious corporations, as we start to politicize those acts, I think we are now poised to have movements that argue for the value of those libraries, that argue against the continuing burning down of these libraries, and that argue for reform and copyright that makes it possible for all of us to thrive in a kind of sharing environment, a some rights reserved environment, instead of just applying this maximal copyright doctrine to the Internet with almost reflexively, this idea that everything on the Internet should work as though it were physical objects being, or rights to physical objects being discussed in corporate boardrooms by lawyers from Fortune 100 entertainment companies, but instead act a lot more like culture. That it's this recognition that culture isn't just novels and operas, but it's the story that you tell your friends around the campfire that's half based on a novel that you once read and partly out of your own imagination, and then you fill in the gaps with some Scooby-Doo episodes that you half remember.
I want to talk a little bit about your work with the EFF. I know you don't work with them right now, but the EFF is probably the organization that's responsible for, digital civil rights around the world, arguably. A recent guest of mine said that, the free culture and free software movement, or the open, source movement, gets way more attention than it deserves. That it's like the most hyped thing out there. But things like, the work of the EFF and these, work towards freeing dissident voices, things like that, those are the real projects that are not being paid enough attention to. So can you tell us a little bit about the work that the EFF is doing, what you were involved with, and the kind of projects that people really need to be aware of as far as the larger free culture movements that EFF is kind of backing?
Sure. Although I'd hate to try and say that the EFF succeeds or fails at the success or failure of the free culture or the free software movement. I think that they're very, very related to one another, and that the two of them rise. The two of them rise and fall together, and we're certainly comrades in arms. Electronic Frontier Foundation is the oldest technology-oriented civil liberties group in the world. They have an office in San Francisco, a new office in Brussels that works on European issues, and an office in D.C., Washington D.C., where we do. I beg your pardon, I'm just blowing my buffer here. Where we do lots of freedom of information requests.
Okay.
And EFF essentially works to uphold the same liberties that an organization like the American Civil Liberties Organization might work on, but in the virtual world. And that is something that we really need. As we move stuff to the virtual world, we have this question over and over again: what is the virtual world like? Is it Is it like the real world but with less freedom, or is it like the real world but with more freedom? Is an email like a conversation in a bar and therefore subject to wiretapping without any kind of specific oversight, without any judicial oversight, without a warrant, or is it like a postal letter, in which case you can't open it up without involving the judge? And EFF argues for the most liberty-centric approach to this kind of work, and so that, I think, has served EFF in good stead. Right now, EFF has got a couple of major cases they're working on. The one that's probably most famous is they're in the midst of suing the American government and AT&T for an indiscriminate program of wiretapping across the entire Internet, where everyone who used an Internet connection that passed through San Francisco had all of their communications wiretapped by the National Security Agency with the cooperation of AT&T. And that was really deadly, and that was really a bad precedent for the way that we live. And so I'm really hopeful about this. What I worked for EFF was mostly standards, policy, and treaties, which is to say international instruments that were being used to take away liberties all around the world. I worked on something called the broadcast flag in America. That was an effort to require those who built digital televisions to agree to not put in certain features and to add DRM, and it would have prohibited making free software that could be used to touch digital television signals, whether that was as a tuner or subsequently as a player. So it would have ultimately impacted all of computer components and all free software. And I also worked on a series of treaties with the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is the specialized UN agency that does copyright, trademark, patent, and similar treaties.
Right.
Mostly trying to ensure that licenses that were liberal, like the Creative Commons license, weren't superseded by treaties that would take away the right of the creator to choose to allow to share his material.
Well, that's interesting because, I mean, generally when people talk about the WIPO, you think of them as the guys promoting purely restrictive U.S. copyright law all over the world and imposing it on, somewhat naive third world countries. So the fact that there was even a discussion about open licensing and things like Creative Commons is surprising in a way.
I actually think that what you've got is the correct impression. That in fact, WIPO was not interested in preserving the rights of people who produced material for free reuse. That instead, what happened was that they were creating treaties that would take away those rights, and we showed up to argue for them.
Oh, okay. And how did that work out? I mean, did people actually pay attention, or
Yeah, well, particularly some of the developing nations delegates were very interested in this.
Okay.
They really felt like this was an important issue, and they saw the direct benefits of using free and open source software at home, and they really worried that the taking away of free and open source licensing through international treaty instruments would be bad for their national policy.
As a science fiction author, I want to ask you what you think the future of open licensing and free culture are. I mean, there's obviously a lot going on right now. Everything from open source biotechnology to open source sex, which is, I mean, I'm not really sure what that means. But where does
I think it's like polyamory, except you tell everyone who you're sleeping with.
That's what the internet is.
Yeah.
But we're kind of coming to the point where on one of your lectures at USC, the Barlow-Gilmore lecture, John Gilmore brought up the fact that we are basically at the cusp where nanotechnology and bioengineering are going to allow us to replicate virtually everything we need to within our lifetimes. So where do you see the great future of free culture? And also, what are the things that we need to be worried about once we open up this Pandora's box of freedom for anyone to create derivative works, to start playing around with all of this technology that, the impacts of which are still very unknown?
Well, I think the freedom to make derivative works isn't new or technological. And in fact, I think that it predates copyright. That if you look at the history of songs or stories, that what you see is that all through human history, the way that we've made new things is by composting old things.
Well, when you start talking about derivative works from bioengineering's perspective, then it starts getting a little weird.
Well, so well, even that I think has been governed by a kind of laissez-faire ethos. After all, there was once only one kind of dog.
Right. Yeah.
Dog breeders don't secure permission from one another to make derived breeds.
Good point.
This happens. Albeit over a period of centuries sometimes. That said, I think that, as a science fiction writer, I'm careful not to ever try to predict the future, because I understand as a science fiction writer how unpredictable the future is. I try to focus on writing allegories about the present, which is, I think, the most that a science fiction writer can aspire to doing. I think that, that we will face a spasm whose impact will be weird in ways that we can't anticipate. It's not just going to be about the idiots from the Automobile Association of America going after all those people who are ripping off the auto industry by cloning autos on their home printers.
Right.
I think we're going to see stuff like, I've just finished a novel in which a huge crisis is precipitated by the fact that it just doesn't cost enough money to start a company anymore, and so all the capital has nowhere to go.
Wow.
If you're a venture capital firm that's accustomed to spending, $3 million as a first round in a startup, and $16 million as a second round, and $150 million as a third round, and then getting out with a $1 billion IPO, and if it only costs $10,000 to start a company and $15,000 to field the product, then exactly what happens to the capital?
Wow.
And if that company can be cloned, and if everything that it does can be cloned and put it and marketed at essentially marginal cost of goods inside of 6 months, and if the search cost for finding a substitute, something that's been cloned and is manufactured, is essentially zero, so you can find that duplicate product, then you can imagine that at $15,000 you could probably recoup your investment inside of 6 months and keep making more stuff. But where does all the venture capital go? What happens to industrial society when you just can't accumulate wealth fast enough? And in this novel, I have people doing all kinds of crazy things. Like, one thing that starts happening is that smart entrepreneurs start buying up the grievances of small companies that have been clobbered by big companies, and suing the big companies on behalf of the small companies in exchange for a share for the winnings from it. And they start to go and try and break the back of giant Fortune 100 companies on the American judiciary system as a way of sort of cracking the capital out of these huge behemoths, and then redistributing it in $10,000 and $15,000 increments. There's a real problem, though. The human cost of distributing capital in $15,000 increments is substantial.
Right.
I don't know if you're familiar with the Grameen Bank in Sri Lanka. These guys who go around making tiny investments in women's cooperatives that want to buy a goat or a cell phone, or something that can have direct economic development benefit in their little town. That's really labor intensive. They have an incredibly high ROI. The repayment rate is higher than any other bank in the world.
Yes.
But they spend a lot of time, beating the bush looking for people to loan to.
Right. And their filtering rate is also pretty high. They have to be very careful about who they loan the money to as well. It's not just an open loaning policy.
Well, I don't know that that's substantially different from a traditional bank. I mean, banks here seem to not just throw money at people either, unless it's in the form of credit cards, and that's mostly not because they're filtering you, but because they understand that the law will let them come after you and basically indenture you if you run off on your credit card balance.
Yeah. Well, on the
I think that the future is going to be weird. I don't think it's going to be predictable in a way that I respect Gilmore as an entrepreneur, and this might be the difference between an entrepreneur and a science fiction writer, and I kind of do a little both. Is that an entrepreneur really does try and predict the future and feel a need for it, whereas the science fiction writer just tries to figure out just how weird the present is.
Right. Wow. Okay.
If you are just tuning in, this is Open Views on KRUU-LP. I'm speaking with Cory Doctorow about his experiences with free culture and his insights into copyright reform. Cory is an award-winning science fiction author and a blogger at boingboing.net.
I got to ask you about the business side, because most of this is about making money, and maybe I should throw you the hard question, which is, if you said, the studios need to figure out a better model for making money in a DRM-free world. What if you were, let's say, the head of Warner? What would your strategy be?
See, I'm not convinced that copying actually hurts Warner. So if I were the head of Warner, I would just stop suing people, and I would say, look, we're going to produce this material. We're going to encourage you to copy it, and we are going to ask for the people who distribute it to you, like ISPs, for a blanket license payment in exchange for access to our catalog. Say a couple of bucks a month a customer for any one studio, or $10 a month a customer for all of the studios for unlimited access to the whole catalog using anything that you want. $10 a month a human being, which is essentially what we're talking about here, is a load of money.
Yeah. Well, and arguably they've made so much money even after all of their complaints about peer-to-peer and file sharing and all this.
Well, sure. I mean, they could just sit pat. I mean, it's not like they're weeping into their beer. But I mean, if I were looking at a way to maximize profits, I would turn up at ISPs and I would say, look, you sell a totally commodified product. Your product is supposed to be identical to all your competitors' products.
Right.
To say our packets are different from our competitors is to say that our packets are inferior. How would you like to be able to advertise this internet connection comes with all the movies ever made?
Yeah, that's and I'm sure that a lot of people are thinking about that model now. Well, and
you don't worry about the people that aren't complying. You worry about making it as attractive as possible to comply.
Yeah, you make it easy.
Making the rates good, making the licensing system easy.
Well, as far as packets being, one form or another, the question of net neutrality. Now, this is a huge thing, and it's going to become huger because of the big, the presidential campaign. All of the candidates are basically putting most of their eggs into the internet basket and doing internet campaigning. This is going to be a big issue, and there was a big debate about it a couple of days ago that devolved into basically name-calling between the people who are proponents of net neutrality and the people who are opponents. What's your take on net neutrality, and can you educate my audience about why it's so important?
Well, net neutrality is the idea that when you ask for a packet over the internet, that your ISP should do its best to give it to you, and not go to the person whose packet you've requested and say, I have some customers that might be interested in your packets. If you give me some money, I'll deliver them.
Right.
It's the idea that when Google pays for its bandwidth and when I pay for my bandwidth, that we've already paid for all the bandwidth we need to pay for, and Google doesn't need to arrange a separate payment with every ISP in the world to ensure that its packets are delivered to those customers. It's certainly not in the customer's interest to see to it that some providers give you better service than others because your ISP has managed to extort money from them, and that your ISP has therefore degraded all of the competitors who can't get it. And it's the telcos that argue for this, and there's not really any single good argument for it. I mean, they ultimately say, well, if we can't charge for access to our pipes, then we won't be able to provide the pipes, but it's just rubbish. I mean, anyone who's ever done any hard research on what it's like to cripple the internet as opposed to adding capacity to the internet has concluded that adding capacity is always cheaper than shaping traffic, than crippling the internet.
And there's also a disingenuous argument from the telco's perspective because they've been making more money as a result of creating more bandwidth. It's not like the bandwidth has gotten cheaper over the years.
Well, I think the wholesale price of bandwidth actually has dropped, but I think that they're still making more profits if you look at their bottom lines. It's just greed.
Right.
Now, the question as to why it's important is that the Internet has presented a neutral platform on which people can build without respect of whether or not they can deploy an army of guys with good teeth and suits to go and shake the hands of every telco in the world and convince them to open their firewalls and open their ports so that their traffic can get through. When Tim Berners-Lee was sitting around at his high-energy physics lab in Switzerland dreaming up a better way to share documents and inventing the World Wide Web, what he had to concern himself with was designing the best technology for it, not figuring out how to convince venal telecoms executives to let him put it on their network. And that's the real difference. And, I just don't have any time for the telcos' arguments. They've yet to advance a single good one. These companies are the biggest welfare bums in the world. There isn't a single telco that doesn't owe its entire existence to the largesse of the taxpayer, who, through the government, has allowed them to secure rights of ways into every basement of every home in the country. Something that is, priceless, incalculably valuable totally at public expense,
Right.
operating supposedly in the public interest, for these corporate welfare bums to go around and say, don't regulate the Internet, when really what we're saying is, no, we're not going to regulate the Internet. We're going to regulate you people who've enjoyed our largesse, and make sure that you deliver good value in return for the special privilege you've been granted by our politicians. It's an embarrassing lie for them to tell.
Right. A few final questions.
Sure.
First, you made a switch from Mac to Ubuntu, and I want to ask you about that. Why, and what's your experience been?
Well, why was multi-factor. One is that the Mac OS just kept getting more and more restrictive. They were shipping units that had trusted computing in them, and they wouldn't tell anyone what they were for. They subsequently stopped including trusted computing, but Steve Jobs clearly fancies himself these days to be as much an entertainment executive as anything else, and the platform is adding new restrictions through things like the iPhone, which can only be used with one carrier, that has iTunes that can only be used with one store, and so on and so forth. And it just seemed like it was time to get out while the getting was good. I still have data that I authored on an Apple II Plus in 1979 live and running on my ThinkPad, which is running Ubuntu. I didn't want to ever get into a situation where I was using proprietary file formats, proprietary operating systems, proprietary applications that might lock me in. It's just too dangerous.
Oh, excellent.
And so Ubuntu looked like a good choice. I had some friends who'd used it. I'd looked over their shoulder. I played with it a little. It seemed like it worked well. It was pretty solid. And that's indeed my experience of it. I bought a ThinkPad that was about $1,000 cheaper than a comparably outfitted PowerBook. It has about 3 or 4 times the battery life. It's got like a 9-hour, 10-hour battery in good circumstances, if I don't run the optical drive and so on. It has a separate bay that I can stick another hard drive in, so I've now got 240 gigs online, which is great, because I only use a laptop, so having a spare hard drive at home did me no good. And runs Ubuntu really well, so well that I haven't actually had much call to post about it, because it just works all the time. There's not much to say. I have an operating system. It works. It gets out of my way.
Excellent.
There are a few things that, where I would prefer that it works a little more like the Mac. Like, so far the iPod support stinks. I've been told that it gets better if you fix some stuff. I haven't figured out what to fix. But I had lots of problems connecting peripherals to my Mac, too, over the years. And my Samba sharing isn't as easy as I'd like it to be. And there's something else. Oh, yeah, Flickr Uploader. The Flickr Uploader in the application I'm using for organizing my photos, which is otherwise very good, is a little clunky.
Huh. Okay.
So I'm hoping that someone makes a better Flickr Uploader. But apart from that, I mean, those are pretty minor complaints about an operating system that costs me nothing and
Right.
works as well, if not better, than the Mac, and where every program I use on it was totally, absolutely free.
If you had to create a free culture project or product, what would it be? I mean, what do you think is missing that someone needs to focus on?
Oh, goodness. I think that there are lots of them, although one that I've got a meeting about tomorrow that I'm really excited about is the idea of creating a collecting society for independent, Creative Commons-oriented and college bands that would offer licenses mostly to college campuses at a very low rate, between, say, 25 cents and 50 cents per student, and in exchange grant a license on behalf of all the artists under representation to download their music using any protocol that you choose to, from any host anywhere in the world.
Sort of like a BMI and ASCAP
license to have it.
Sort of like BMI and ASCAP for Creative Commons?
But offering this stuff on terms that is totally consistent with how people actually use technology. So subsequently granting the right, included in that, to use that music to sync with student films and with other projects, to remix it, to mash it up, to sample it, and so on, and to offer that license to college campuses across the world and to any other ISP that wants it, but to focus on college campuses that are already under tremendous pressure to, say, spend $10 a month on like a Rhapsody license that gives their students the rights to download songs that they can't keep from one host, only one little piece of catalog, and not do anything with those songs except listen to them, and offer a much more liberal slate for much less money, and start to show that there is an alternative in the same way that, ASCAP at one point boycotted radio. They wanted to have a different kind of licensing deal with radio in the early days. They wanted per track payments and all kinds of really onerous terms that radio never could have delivered. And so radio just boycotted ASCAP. They just licensed music from other collecting societies. They formed BMI to represent what was called race and hillbilly music, which is to say black music and country music.
Right.
And that and public domain music was all they played on the radio for a couple of years while ASCAP came around. And I think if colleges and other people who are already gearing up to pay big license fees to the collecting societies and to the labels, instead of paying those to them, bought their music from alternative sources who would give them the liberal licensing terms they need, that would start to put an enormous amount of pressure on these labels to start behaving like good citizens of the digital era, instead of like blacksmiths upset about the advent of the locomotive who are vowing to wreck the tracks before it can put them out of the horseshoe business.
Right. Oh, cool. And do you have a favorite free culture or open source or free software product, project, or idea?
Well, there are a couple that I'm on the board of. One is Democracy Player, which is a brilliant
awesome.
internet TV platform that you subscribe to the channels you love, and shows stream in using BitTorrent, and they play no matter what video format they're in because it has VLC built in and it'll play any format in the universe. It's great stuff. And I'm also on the board of MusicBrainz, which produces a catalog of metadata about music that can be freely used by anyone implementing players as an alternative to GraceNote, which is a big, evil proprietary platform where they took the labor of you and me and everyone else who ever entered a track name into iTunes or another music player, and they basically stole it from us, locked it up, and started selling it to people who would then roll the cost of providing that into the products they delivered to us.
Okay. The final question is, if you had to change something about the free culture movement or the free software movement, what do you think it would be? Or do you think that they're doing everything they're doing everything right?
There's always room for change. In terms of things that I would like the free software movement to deliver to me, the one thing that I would love to have for Ubuntu, and I don't know if this really answers your question, but the one thing I'd love to have for Ubuntu that would be just killer would be a service for easily sharing my Wi-Fi over the Ethernet and easily sharing the Ethernet over the Wi-Fi, which is something the Mac OS had, and it was brilliant. You check into a hotel, maybe two of you sharing the room with two laptops, but only one Ethernet jack. You plug the Ethernet jack into the computer, share the network connection, and away you go. And I've used this so many times in so many different contexts. The most fascinating were ones where, because of antenna characteristics or incompatibilities, one or more in the room couldn't log into the infrastructure network, the network that was being provided by the access point. And so what we had done is we would take the machine that could connect to the access point, we'd bridge it to Ethernet, we'd plug the Ethernet into another machine that would then make a new Wi-Fi network out of it that was compatible with the local machines. That was so cool, and I've done it so many times, and it feels so good to provide communications access to people who are otherwise deprived. It was great. So I really hope that we'll get stuff like that.
Okay. And I always leave a couple of minutes for anything I may have left out, something that you wanted to say, so your final words, basically.
Well, the only thing that I would do here is plug my new short story collection, Overclocked, Stories of the Future Present, which you can download all the stories from at craphound.com/overclocked. The collection sold out its print run in the first 3 weeks. Back to the presses now. It'll be
How big was the first run?
It wasn't big. It was, it was under 5,000 copies. But my first short story collection was half of what this one was, and it took 3 times as long to sell out. So short story collections, are small literary vanity projects, and for this to sell out as big a print run as it did in as short a time as it did is very heartening.
But I mean, this basically goes back to prove the point that you can give your stuff away for free and still make money because somebody still wants to buy the book.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, to the extent that anyone's making money off short story collections, I sure am.
Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you.
Take sampling to the next step.
Yeah.
That's a clean sample.
Taking sounds and meshing them together, putting them all in time.
You've been listening to Cory Doctorow, right here on OpenViews on KRUU-LP. Cory's website is craphound.com, where you can download his novels for free. They're all licensed under a Creative Commons type license. And you can also listen to his books. Many of his works have been released as MP3s as well as text, so you can download the audio and listen if you've got a moral aversion to reading for some reason. Music on today's show is from ccmixter.org. I started off with Triphonic doing a remix titled Bored on Your Backside. Now playing is Triphonic with The Next Step. And coming up next is Ditto doing a remix of Vieux Farka Touré's Anna, which is still on the CC Mixter remix competition. Vieux Farka Touré is the up-and-coming artist, son of Ali Farka Touré, who died in March. It's this great Mali blues musician. Remember that KRUU depends on your support, so go to KRUUFM.com and contribute your $10 a month to keep this community project going strong. We'd hate to get to the point where we have to nag you every month or every week for getting money from you guys like NPR does. Thank you for tuning in to Open Views. Join me again next week. I'm Sundar Raman. Good night.
The only thing different is the tools of the trade. Instead of harpsichords, we play juke for the eights. Instead of orchestras, it's computer displays. Reinventing sounds in original ways. I transform the source till it don't sound alike. Sampling is much more than just a copy, right?
If it sounds good and feels good, then that's it.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Atina Ar-Rahmanir Rahman wa Bismillahir